Well, hello there, and welcome one and all once again to PsychoSocial Healing 0.5. This is a 5-week free workshop each Sunday at 7 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, and I will be active in the group during the week, creating fun and helpful ways for you to learn more, interact, ask questions, and together we'll help improve and maximize our experience here. This course covers the topics of our social nature, anxiety, stress, trauma, and self-esteem. This is the abridged version of PsychoSocial Healing 1.0, which is now available at www.psychosocialhealing.com. I'm offering a limited time discount for those who join me on this journey. For as long as this course is live, the offer will be available. I want to offer my most sincere thanks for making the investment of time to participate, and in doing so, investing in yourself. Seriously, I want that investment to be worth it. You want that investment to be worth it. So this is the one true premium, the one investment you can never get back: your time. Investing in your growth enough to do the exercises, come back each week, and being serious enough to change is what will make this course worth your time. And as I said, you're not getting this time back. So it's best to treat this time for its priceless nature and squeeze the absolute most out of me and yourself. None of this will work unless you do. With that in mind, I am so excited about sharing with you what has been years and years of study, action, growing from adversity, engaging in psychotherapy and doing inner work, distilled down to 5 chapters with exercises at the end for you to internalize the lessons learnt. Today is chapter 4, Trauma. Here we'll discuss how and why trauma hits us, and why sometimes we're in its clutches before we're even born. We will develop new paradigms to healing damage and growing into a better person. So grab a notepad, lock in, and let's dive in. Peter Levine, from his book Healing Trauma, says, quote, "People are traumatized when their ability to respond to a threat is in some way overwhelmed," end quote. Trauma is the name given to when we experience extreme stress that overwhelms our ability to cope. When something happens to us and our ability to respond is disabled in that moment. It is the petrifying stare of Medusa. Trauma can happen fast or develop gradually over a period of time. Something out of the blue, like a car crash or sudden death of a relative, are psychological blunt force traumas, where we are forced into the trauma cycle before you have time to process just what the hell happened. Alternatively, something gradual, like a toxic or abusive relationship, is a slow poison dripping of our physiology, gradually robbing us of our self-esteem, our confidence, and eventually our ability to function well. Fortunately, our culture is now starting to develop an understanding of how trauma can develop over time when stuck in an extremely stressful situation. This results in a psychological stress injury. As we go forward, recognizing trauma as an injury instead of an illness is not only a more realistic way to look at trauma, but it also will help address the shame and frustration that can sometimes come with trauma. Whether we shame ourselves for not reacting in time to a sudden trauma, or shame ourselves for allowing an abusive situation to wear us down into compliance, the fact is that we have sustained an injury, and for that we require care and a relevant therapeutic process to enable healing. The neurobiology of trauma. Now, while I did my due diligence on getting the science right, I am but a layman. So you're about to get some simplified explanations of very complex neuroscience, which isn't always straightforward. Everyone's brain functions slightly differently, sometimes wildly differently. So this information can be updated if incorrect in the larger course in development. Meet the limbic system. This is effectively the hub of our survival functions, emotions, and memory. When we are triggered into survival stress, the avenues of action are limited to fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Your best chances at survival requires a speed of disengaging, fleeing, defensive, or offensive behaviors. If we had to wait for our thinking brain to logically understand a threat before we could respond, we would not have survived. This is why the thinking brain goes swiftly offline during survival stress. It's too slow to manage mere survival. We're going to focus on several key organs that are involved in the trauma response. First up, the thalamus. The word thalamus comes from the Greek language, meaning chamber, which fits as it's a literal chamber of sensory experience as the information is sorted and sent where it needs to go. Think of it like New York's Grand Central Station for sensory input. Incoming information deemed as a threat is sent directly to the amygdala. This is the control center for what could be called the threat reflex. It has been referred to by some as the brain's smoke detector, in the sense that it is in part a wailing alarm that recognizes smoke and just goes off when it detects it. Think of it like an outrage department staffed by hyper-offendable people who almost instantly categorize incoming information as either threat or benign and stores the information for how it felt at the time. You see, the amygdala remembers how something felt, not necessarily how it happened in reality. So the memories will be emotionally tainted, disorganized fragments. So for the memory context of what it's responding to, the amygdala consults with the hippocampus. This part of the limbic system helps store and recall memories. Think of the hippocampus as the data entry center, which precedes long-term storage in the cortex. It does its best to store them in chronological order so that when we call up the memory in question, it will hopefully be a cohesive chain of events as we remembered it. During a traumatic event, the input received is an emotionally exaggerated Tarantino movie that doesn't stay slotted in place. So they float around while the hippocampus starts producing cortisol to numb the pain of being locked in survival mode with images and sensations. The HPA axis. This is the name given to the conduit between the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal glands to form the beginning of our endocrine system, where the brain communicates with the body, releases necessary hormones for growth, for sleep, biological functions, etc. The hypothalamus. This is the control link between the brain, the endocrine system, and the nervous system. When activated, the hypothalamus signals directly down the spinal cord to the adrenal glands, while at the same time waking up the pituitary. This organ is controlled by the messages sent hormonally from the hypothalamus. Think of the hypothalamus as Blackadder and the pituitary as Baldric. When excited, the pituitary signals down to the adrenal glands, When the adrenals are signalled, they release cortisol and aldosterone, otherwise known as adrenaline, into the bloodstream. Inherited trauma. All it takes is to have parents or even grandparents that have experienced trauma and not resolved it, and you are from birth more predisposed to anxiety and depression. What's worse is that living with anxiety and depression increases your likelihood of having an adverse childhood experience. So, trauma on this level can be, if you don't work through it, a complex self-feeding chain that latches on to the next generation and even the generation after that before they're even born. This is what's known as inherited trauma, and its effects are felt across 3 generations if nothing is done to resolve those traumas. It's already been very well established that the precursor egg from which we grow has already been formed in our mother's ovaries when she is a 5-month fetus in the womb of our grandmother. This means that 3 generations shared the same body and thus the same biological environment. With all this said, it's clear to see that the imprints of traumas experienced by your grandmother while pregnant are passed down through to your mother and then through to you in a direct cellular developmental relationship. Similarly, the precursor sperm cells from which we came from, from which we grow, they came from your father while he was still in the womb. The implications become more vast when we consider that while our mother's eggs stop multiplying when they form, your father's sperm, and thus the genetic starting blocks you've begun with, are being continuously shaped until just before you are conceived. I want you to write down the following phrase. Instead of passing things on, pass things back. I'll say that again. Instead of passing things on, pass things back. Let's consider the first environment we experience, the prenatal period in our mother's womb. Through the placenta, we receive nutrients, hormones, and other information from our mother's bloodstream. This also means that the emotional states of the mother will be transferred biochemically to the unborn child and change their genetic expression. Prolonged stress, anger, or fear experienced by the mother during pregnancy can become imprinted on the fetus, as the child is literally in a stage of being pre-programmed to the kind of environment it is growing into. A mother experiencing stress will cause her unborn child to mirror the stress response, as their systems are linked. Later in life, individuals can develop symptoms that have no explanation, whether it is elevated anxiety, magnified upset, aggression, intrusive thoughts, or even physical symptoms like phantom pain, inflammation, or even in the case of Mark Wallin, author of It Didn't Start With You, a temporary loss of vision. These symptoms are coming from somewhere. Perhaps you have at some point in your life experienced a singular or persistent medical problem that had no explanation despite having had all the necessary tests and scans. It is possible that that is an inherited trauma response. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. These are some of the first core wounds that happens to us, and they are the most cruel because they happen to us at a time when we haven't even developed the knowledge of what was happening, what we were feeling, let alone developed the skills to interpret and manage said emotions. There could be said to be 2 categories of ACEs. Number one, the things that shouldn't happen but do, and number two, the things that should happen but don't. The things that shouldn't happen but do are things like witnessing or experiencing abuse in all its forms, violence, bullying, neglect, and abandonment. The things that should happen but don't are things such as certain forms of neglect, proximal abandonment, where a caregiver is physically present but emotionally unavailable to the child, and lack of compassionate touch. According to the CDC, 1 in 6 adults reported to have experienced 4 or more different types of ACEs. At least 5 of the top 10 leading causes of death are associated with ACEs, and the prevention of ACEs could reduce the number of depressed adults by 44%. Post-trauma. Traumatic experiences have potential after effects, now known as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. As I mentioned earlier, I personally prefer the term post-traumatic stress injury. This is caused when the traumatic survival stress gets stored in the brain and body, and over time it lies in wait to trip the amygdala's threat reflex when exposed to stimuli, situations, or people associated with the trauma. This is what we call a trigger episode or traumatic activation. If you are dealing with trauma yourself and your day-to-day functioning is being compromised, you need to seek a trauma-informed therapist who is qualified and competent to help you in a way that can address your particular situation. Hypervigilance. This is the name given to the state so often experienced by trauma survivors. Think of an armed and jittery soldier with an itchy trigger finger. He's in control of your red alert button. As a result, you are far less trusting and forgiving of potential threats and far more resistant to the idea of trusting. This is the arena where we see the negativity bias feeding our ease to be alarmed. All threats are spotted, labelled, and avoided. Perhaps you trusted the wrong person in a delicate situation, and they took the opportunity to hurt you the most when you were the weakest to prevent it. You will be far less likely to trust that person, or maybe anyone, again. Trust will feel like standing before them with your back facing a cliff edge. They've already pushed you off once. How can we trust them not to do it again? Surely it just makes more sense to be on my guard from now on. Don't let anyone in, at least until I can trust them. And I got to test that trust to see if they're truly genuine. I got to do this the safest way because I couldn't handle being hurt again. Does any of that sound familiar? Rumination. Another facet of how trauma often plays out during dissociative episodes. This is something that I cover both here and in the chapter on anxiety. However, unlike anxious rumination, which tends to be more general about the future, traumatic rumination is much more specific to a past trauma. If memories are like a library, rumination is when you get drawn into shouting exchanges in the library. When an intrusive thought or emotion comes in, it arrives as a bubble of reality that you get sucked into. There the mind will replay a past trauma over and over in a desperate effort to figure out what went wrong, why you acted or failed to act, why you allowed them to do what they did. What if they didn't? What did even worse? Why didn't I speak up? What if I did speak up? We ask ourselves open-ended, unanswerable questions because the reality is still too painful to accept. As a result, we will try in vain to rewrite the narrative with what we now retrospectively think we should have done or not done. We reimagine how it might have gone if only we did the thing or said the thing we should have. Hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. But we take that hindsight and we torture ourselves with it. We weave these fantasies of a better past, only to have to come out of it and be starkly reminded of the reality of what actually did happen. Reenactment. One overwhelming tendency that trauma can bestow upon us is the tendency to compulsively or reflexively recreate or relive past traumas, or to create new traumas through recklessness. When rumination fails to scratch that itch, we resort to creating a new one, and another, because there are so many possible combinations. Reenactment is both a form of self-sabotage and identity reinforcement. An example would be a young woman being drawn to the same kind of abusive guy. She is making sure that her partners are reinforcing what she feels she deserves. She knows they're bad for her, but she is sticking with a familiar dynamic. As the saying goes, red flags don't look like red flags when they look like home. This tendency of reenactment has even been noted to have a sequential quality. Namely, people would sometimes unconsciously replicate the situation of a past trauma on an anniversary of it. Social trauma. Okay, let's not beat around the bush here. The experience of living under the current system, the monetary market system, is traumatizing, either directly or indirectly, but mostly both. Our social traumas mostly begin at school age, when first we suffer the separation from the caregiver to be surrounded by other kids and grown-ups that we don't know, and then later when we experience the forces of social hierarchies and the politics that plays out within and around them. Kids who are different are often ostracized for that difference, and other kinds of betrayal and rejection from the group or activities can occur. When we grow older to high school age, kids can become enforcers and followers of dictates of the social order. You're only cool if you wear these kind of shoes, and if you wear that kind, we will mercilessly mock you for it, for being uncool. We may even become tempted to start bullying you. Then in adulthood, the potential traumas develop even more. When we think about the kind of direct systemic sources of trauma in our social system, we find a constant, almost default running stressor of the fact that in this system, you are considered inherently undeserving of continued life, unless you spend a great deal of your time engaging in servitude to earn these debt tokens called money, which we then use to satisfy the price tags put on basic life needs such as food, shelter, etc. This is what is now being finally known as the cost of living crisis. A crisis symptomatic of a system that puts servitude or begging and money between the population and their survival. For some, money only affects their overall standard of living. However, for an increasing number of people, this stressor is bearing down so far into their standard of living that their situation is detrimental to their medical and mental health. The UN reported a global 25,000 deaths every 24 hours to starvation alone. Money, or lack thereof, literally dictates who eats and who starves. Having this kind of system inevitably creates a highly stratified society, a stressor that we are literally allergic to. The creation of the haves also leads to the creation of the have-nots. And billions are currently suffering a myriad of problems at the bottom of this pyramid scheme that we laughably call an economy. The workers aren't much better off overall, as they are suspended in a small pocket of existence between poverty and prosperity. And there is an underlying current always dragging us down towards poverty. And the only thing to buy you safety distance from the serrated jaws of poverty under the monetary system is money. And the closer you are to the point of poverty, the deeper your survival stress, and thus the sharper the potential decline of health. Enmeshment trauma, vicarious trauma. This is a term that describes the contagious nature of trauma in close quarters. Enmeshment means that two or more people have become interwoven on an emotional and identity level, normally because one person has emotional needs that are so great and intense that the other literally sacrifices their time, self-concern, and even identity to meet those needs. Another term for this is anxious codependence. We can often see this happen between a traumatized person and their caregiver. Any caregiver, friend, relative, or partner who is in consistent contact with someone who is traumatized is at risk of developing enmeshment trauma. One of the first warning signs you may be on your way to enmeshment trauma is known as compassion fatigue, which is what it sounds like. You are becoming fatigued from the amount of compassion that you are having to employ. So much so that the cup runneth empty, as it were. As a result, our ability to empathize has become exhausted and we begin to burn out. When there is burnout of compassion, we have a diminished or absent immune response, as it were, to potential traumas, and we begin to absorb the emotions of others. Raw empathy is what we can potentially resort to once compassion runs dry. This is the connection by which trauma can be downloaded or uploaded, depending on the context, into caregivers. Story time, trauma bond. We're about to explore one example of the process of enmeshment trauma through a story about two broken individuals, Ben and Maureen. Ben was in his early 30s and Maureen was 10 years older and growing estranged from her abusive husband. With mounting physical attacks, it became apparent that a literal rescue mission was necessary. Ben brought her under his roof, where he actually enjoyed a stable life. However, not long after, Maureen slipped into post-trauma. She would be triggered into sympathetic activation so easily that she would shut down for days at a time, fortified behind a barrier of ice that she would expect him to penetrate. Starting with only small instances, which were so minor that it felt unreasonable to object to at the time, she would infrequently engage in emotional and verbal abuse, which began to gradually chip away at his self-esteem. As time passed, he realized that something had to give. He convinced her to go into therapy, which she prematurely ended after only 7 to 8 months. Ben knew that she was nowhere near done with her therapy, but had to accept her decision. He began to allow his friendships, particularly friendships with his female friends, to degrade. He passed up on opportunities to go out and spend time with his friends, opting instead to spend time with her, as her emotional needs were so great. Years into the relationship, Ben's mental health had declined quite significantly. He had become scared and unsafe around her. He would regularly lock himself in the bathroom or finding moments of solitude during the day and have secretive crying fits. It was then that he began going to therapy himself. Her dysfunction, and thus also their relationship, had developed into a pattern of abuse known as a trauma bond. She had spent so long being a victim of abuse that she had become completely accustomed to a toxic and abusive dynamic. But because Ben was not an abusive person, she had to become the abuser to maintain the dynamic so familiar to her. And in her complete identification with her victimhood, she would project the abuse onto him. Over the years, they would occasionally come dangerously close to breaking up. They would resolve to stay together, but before long, the abusive dynamics would emerge again. Her usual tactics of emotional and verbal abuse would even on a couple of occasions escalate to physical abuse. Even then, Ben accepted it as par for the course, or that he deserved it somehow. It was becoming more and more clear that no matter how much inner work he did, no matter how many times he had the talk with her, he was going to keep backsliding. He was not going to fully heal in his therapy as long as he was being continually wounded and re-traumatized by her trauma. In a final effort, Ben made the mistake of moving away with her to live with her family, thinking that being around them again would break her patterns of abuse. It didn't. It only took a few more instances of her making passive-aggressive or gaslighting remarks that Ben had finally had enough. He announced to her that he was leaving and made the necessary arrangements to get his things and move away. After 7 years of being trapped in enmeshment, he escaped and forged a new life for himself. Solutions to trauma. Okay, we've gone through some tough, perhaps triggering material. It certainly was for me while writing this. We've talked a lot about what trauma is, the mechanisms at play, how it feels, and we're about to talk how we move out of trauma for one major reason, that it doesn't define you. Just like a hurdle jumper isn't defined by any hurdle they have jumped. Sure, the jumping of it is an achievement that teaches you about your damage, adds to your overall experience, and hopefully leaves you at least armed with the knowledge of how you can renegotiate. Trauma is not an identity you ever want to keep, because there are dangerous stakes to that identity. A life lived in survival mode is often not a long or high quality one. There is a reason why animals who live literal life and death struggles every day do not develop PTSD. It's because they automatically go through a process of releasing and reorienting to the physical world and to safety. We humans must learn how to complete the trauma cycle and consciously implement it if we wish to be free from trauma's spell. Otherwise, our so-called advanced monkey mind is always willing and able to step in and either act drastically or not at all, whichever it deems will keep you alive. Now that we're in agreement that it's in our best interest to move out of trauma whenever we find ourselves in its grasp, the question remains, how? Allow me to share with you a few evidence-based principles. Somatic experiencing. Our experiences of trauma can often happen quickly. More importantly, our reactions to trauma happen within milliseconds. As a result, our traumas can easily overwhelm and overcome us, and before we know it, The survival stress gets stored in our bodies where it waits to be reactivated. This is why the steps to moving through and resolving trauma intend to slow our perception of the process so we can accept, understand, relocate better sensations, reframe, and make a way through instead of settling somewhere in mere acceptance of what happened and never moving on to healing. Peter Levine created a process that he called somatic experiencing to bring a traumatized person through and out of the trauma cycle and back into their bodies and into the now. The following is my own adaptation of this process. Number 1, freezing, fusing. This is where the trauma happens and the freeze response kicks in. In these moments, we are stuck, frozen in place, and the feelings, thoughts, and sensations are now locked and bonded together. This means that even our self-concept gets bound up. The event, the feelings of immobility and acute stress, and even identity are now enmeshed. The smell of alcohol on the breath of an attacker is now fused and associated to the experience. And from that moment on, anytime you smell that same smell, you can't help but be emotionally catapulted back to the memories of that attack. This is why victims of trauma are overwhelmingly inclined to engage in avoidance and rationalization, because re-traumatization instantly sends you right back there as though you never really left. And we will naturally want to avoid all the associated things that trigger us. This obviously puts us in our ability to lead a normal life. For we either know or fear that we will be triggered and brought right back. So we take standing still or going backwards over moving forward. This is so often the enduring thought process of the traumatized person, where they are neurologically stuck in the past and using that trauma as a template for how they assess the future for threats. This stage is also where, in our frozen state, we often go somewhere else, as it were. This is known as dissociation, when our nervous system becomes overloaded and pulls us out of our bodily experience. Our conscious mind literally checks out because our sensory experience is just too overwhelming. In the most violent survival traumas, this state is what prevents us from feeling the excruciating pain and horror of a mortal injury. Though while this can help in the moment, if there is the threat of pain, it also prevents us from facing the reality of what happened and being able to take decisive action. Dissociation has both a disconnecting and analgesic effect. Accounts of people attacked and nearly killed by wild animals have reported that they entered a separate, almost blissful state where they felt no pain and passively allowed the events to unfold. Similarly, accounts of sexual molestation have reported a feeling akin to some tales of astral projection, where they left their own bodies and witnessed the molestation from a detached, almost third-person perspective. Number 2, defeat, helplessness. The state of helplessness is both an understandable and expected condition of the trauma response. In that moment of traumatization, you're frozen, unable to respond, and as a result, you feel like you can't be counted on to take action. You feel like you are failing. Failing quickly turns to falling as you tumble down the negative spiral. Meet the dorsal raphe nucleus. This is one of the oldest parts of the brain and activates in the face of an uncontrollable or inescapable stressor as a last resort to induce the cognitive component of the freeze response, the conscious conviction that you're trapped or doomed. This state of helplessness is sometimes called learned helplessness. This was first properly documented in 1967 in a series of experiments conducted by Dr. Martin Seligman and Stephen Mayer, involving dogs put in a shuttle box with an electrified floor. The dogs that received shocks were more likely to develop behavioural signs of helplessness. While at first it was assumed that this was a learned state, neurological studies conducted by Stephen Mayer in the intervening years discovered that this helplessness is activated in the dorsal raphe nucleus rather than learned. Helplessness is shutting the door on your own escape. It's the prison cell at the bottom of the trauma cycle. Here we can easily serve unforgivably long sentences. While in this prison we fill our time with maladaptive habits in a vain effort to gain our freedom, when in reality we are only making ourselves more at home. We ruminate, we overcompensate, we self-sabotage, and eventually we plead to the world to match the decor of our prison. If we become institutionalized, as it were, to this prison, we become identified with it. We actually create an identity out of our helplessness. We call ourselves a victim. And of course, being a victim is a helpless state, one where the fault and responsibility to change lies elsewhere, and that we should call upon the empathy of others to reinforce this identity. It is in that identification with victimhood that we can find an easy road through existence. We find we can insist that others treat us as we perceive ourselves, as a helpless victim, a victim that literally has had their ability to respond removed, for in that initial phase of traumatization, it was removed. However, staying in the helplessness prison erodes and eventually destroys our ability to nurture the faculty of taking responsibility. This is something that we see often with subcultures like, say, for example, third wave feminism, that embraces and even weaponizes that sense of victimhood to demand that the world bend to the will of the helpless out of the misguided notion that it would make the world safer. There is a perverse and ironic sense of power in weaponized helplessness. Knowing that responsibility is for others to take because you are just too helpless to take it creates the delusion that victims can urge the world to change so that no more victims are created, when in fact it enshrines the very idea of victimhood as a means of positive social change, when all it's doing is expanding the walls of the prison to trap everyone. So instead of expanding the prison, it is in our best interests to escape the prison. Would you like me to show you the way out? Here goes. Number 3, tracking awareness. This is where the recovery process begins. Like an animal tracker who is looking for evidence of the animal's presence and what that evidence suggests about the animal, we are going to run the same process on our inner landscape of bodily sensations. This is what's known in NLP terms as kinesthetic submodalities. Just as our auditory sense organs, our ears, give us further information about the kind of auditory information being received, like volume level, pitch, or clarity, our kinesthetic sense gives us information about the kind of internal physical sensations we are feeling, such as weight, is it heavy or light? Texture, is it rough or smooth? Pressure, is it high or low? Temperature, is it hot or cold, etc. Of course, these sensations are heavily associated to emotions, but right now I want you to stay with just the sensations themselves. So, as we practice becoming attuned to our bodily sensations, we are becoming aware of what our body really feels like and what that's telling us. This is where mindfulness meditation is an especially useful tool. The first two stages of this process, freezing and helplessness, will likely have created a sense that we are stuck with these negative sensations. This perception is a lie. Our inner landscape is always changing. It's only being drawn into the commentator's repetitive yammering that creates the illusion of being stuck. It is completely possible to change our sensation and thus also our narrative by shifting that focus to another part of our body that doesn't feel so bad. I would like you to begin the process of embracing a change. Do you find any places in your body that feel better? If you find yourself focusing on a tightness in your shoulders or a pressure in your abdomen, I'd like you to move that searchlight somewhere else. Take your time to really pay attention to your body here. Sometimes you may notice a more positive sensation because there isn't much active feedback from that part of the body, meaning that there's no pain, no tension, no heaviness. I want you to decide on a place to focus on and notice a change in how you are feeling once you've lingered on that better location of sensation. Number 4, pendulation. For this stage of the process, I want you to begin shifting your awareness from the negative physical experience to the positive, like a gentle pendulum. This process of ebb and flow is something that occurs in nature, like the breath. When we breathe in, the sympathetic nervous system activates, and when we breathe out, the parasympathetic activates. So I want you to think about this process in terms of a necessary rhythm of contraction and expansion. Another reason why a rhythm is necessary is so that you don't get sucked into the negative. Now, this is likely something that may require some practice to really focus on specific parts of your body. For one of the things that our nervous system does best is give us continual proprioception signals to let us know how our body is doing, reminding us that surfaces that we are sitting or standing on are giving resistance as gravity pushes us down onto them. So it will take some repetition to really focus on one specific part of your bodily experience. Bear with this process and it will give you surprising results. Number 5, silver linings. For this step of the renegotiation process, we're going to go on a treasure hunt. We're going to find, identify and take note of all the positive, empowering resources in your memories and in your lives to counteract disempowering events and feelings. We will be seeking out both internal and external resources, metaphorical silver linings to life's clouds that come and go. All the times you felt great achievement, being cherished and or cherishing others, when we have been proud of ourselves, when we asserted our boundaries without becoming reactive. These are examples of internal resources. External resources could be physical objects that have a unique sensation or significance beyond yourself, or interpersonal influences from other people. I'm often reminded of the phrase, "We are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with." Or as I prefer to phrase it, you are an emergent property of your 5 most dominant influences. In particular, we will be focusing on the positive and empowering. These resources bring a warm, calm, and home feeling that's significant in some way. When we sit in these positive feelings and identify with them in terms of this is my experience, we start to acknowledge the changes in our experience and that the negative states are by no means permanent. They are fluid. And in the case of these exercises, a rhythm of pendulation between a positive resource and a negative experience. Number 6, decontamination. Trauma becomes entangled with our sympathetic activation, literally contaminating our life experience with survival stress, both in terms of the content of activation and that any activation is likely to remind us of times of traumatic activation. We start getting the, what now sense of dread when the red alert comes on, instead of feeling fired up and excited about what's coming. From the beginning of the traumatic activation, everything has been squashed together. So now it's time to open up the mechanism and remove the survival stress inside. How to decontaminate is again to pendulate between a feeling of anxiety and a conviction of excitement by creating, or should I say noticing, a silver lining. Number 7, grounding. For now it's time to stop swinging side to side and change things up a bit. This step in the renegotiation process is about allowing a positive physical feeling in the real world to ground you in your body. In the words of Peter Levine, trauma pulls our feet out from under us. Given that analogy, we get trapped in our head while trapped in a frozen moment of being up in the air and no longer properly present or grounded in our bodies. The traumatic, weightless tableau. Grounding is necessary to reconnect us with our bodily experience in a positive way. Similar to when we receive an electric charge, the electricity has to be able to find a path to the earth to prevent greater electrical injury. Imagine being grounded to the physical environment you're in, while also growing upward and outward. The contact points between you and the earth, where are they? When we're standing, it's our feet. When we're sitting, it's our bum, thighs, feet, and maybe our back as well. Develop a steadfast security of your base while also having a flexibility of the upper body. Pendulate between the experience of being grounded and an experience of being ungrounded a few times if you can. Take your time and take note of any changes you experience. One change you may notice is an increase in the next step, which is resilience. Resilience is about our ability to bend without breaking or becoming bent out of shape. The ability to sustain stresses without being deterred from your path. So coming back to the analogy of the tree that is rooted as deep as it reaches to the sky, what does life inevitably throw at us? Storms, of course. To a storm, the tree is just a sitting duck, as it were, unable to affect the forces attacking it from all angles. So it grows to withstand those forces while maintaining its necessary growth pattern. A resilient tree will bend with the wind and then return to its previous position when the wind dies down. Its branches and even trunk can move, but they then return. A not so resilient tree will maybe bend a little and then remain bent or even break. In life, we are sometimes blown down or uprooted completely because we lack the resilience to withstand that storm. Of course, this is because we meet such a force that it's overwhelming. In these moments, It does not serve us to blame ourselves for not being resilient enough, because we are imperfect beings. In a way, resilience is a paradox, but it's a functional truth of human existence, that we must both develop a firm grounding while also having enough flexibility to the forces life will throw at you. Number 9, positive aggression. At this point in the process, you are coming out of the immobility and back into the body. Now, what was present in the body just before the immobility hit? That's right, you were in fight or flight. And those two processes need to complete. So this step is about the completion of the fight response, but in a healthy way. Positive aggression is a natural force of pushing forward, the necessary push that enables us to have a life. It is positive assertiveness. It's decisiveness. To a traumatized person, especially someone in complex trauma, the idea of positive aggression is akin to being a monster, something they couldn't possibly see themselves being. Their perception has been locked into the conviction that they must be timid and agreeable. That's the immobility and the helplessness talking. For that time, during the trauma, you survived by surrendering. However, you cannot live in a state of surrender. That's not even living at all. Through this entire process of somatic experiencing, we have been transmuting these thoughts and sensations and emotions. Now it's time to transmute our response, using the energy of the fight response needing to complete. The exertion of positive aggression can come in a few different forms. When you make a decision, when you change your mind and don't go back, when you take action, when you apply discipline. These are all expressions of positive aggression. Number 10, escape to safety. Just like with the previous step, which was the completion of the fight response, this step is about completing the flight response. There's a National Geographic video that Peter Levine has often referred to, in where a polar bear is pursued and then sedated by tranquilizer dart from a helicopter. The biologists researching its population do what they need to do while the animal is unconscious. The interesting part is when the animal is regaining consciousness. It starts shaking, almost convulsing, with mostly the same muscle groups that it uses to run. These jerking movements are literally the animal making that running escape out the other end of danger, as they were doing just that just before the immobility hit. This is the polar bear coming out of immobility through the flight response, discharging and completing. This happens because the polar bear, like most animals, automatically go through the physiological steps to discharge survival stress and return to homeostasis or equilibrium. Renegotiating survival stress for humans is a case of learning and practicing. The process of this realization of safety requires that you begin to orient again to your environment. So that leads us to number 11, orienting. The orienting response is when your eyes and or head moves to identify any source of novelty or threat, whether that be sudden unexpected sound, an out of the ordinary sight, a threat in a safe environment, etc. This is what you see when most animals are eating or drinking. In herds that are grazing together, orienting can become a transmittable threat readiness mode that spreads through the herd, allowing them all to pretty much in unison suddenly retreat away if threatened or attacked. Some animals are routinely attacked and fed on, by their predator species from within their source of water as they drink. You may have noticed orienting occurring around the dinner table for slightly different reasons. A close family will orient purely for social connection, whereas a dysfunctional family will be threat checking as well. Trauma causes us to become hypervigilant, so our orientation becomes solely about constantly threat checking your environment while flitting back and forth between dissociation and hyper-arousal. The ironic thing is that in this state of hypervigilance, you're actually missing the details of your environment and your life. In order to respond appropriately to life and the varied conditions and experiences it puts us in, we need to be able to take in and process a wide range of stimuli. We need to move from hyper-arousal to relaxed arousal. So make a point of actually noticing things. Notice the vivid colours. Notice the smells, the sounds, and the physical feeling of things. Even if you take just 10 minutes a day to really drink in the sensory experience. So given that you've become more grounded and oriented in the here and now, you will be approaching number 12, completion. This step is a destination in a way. It is the resultant condition of having completed the trauma cycle and emerged out the other end. Of course, this doesn't mean that it's all completely behind you. Trauma has a habit of working in periodic cycles, so we will need to move through again to completion at the next activation or trigger. We will know we are in completion when we are no longer feeling frozen, helpless and stuck, no longer being contaminated, ungrounded and agreeable, and back into a flow of stimulus and response. When we are seeing things for how they actually are, instead of how it felt at the time of activation. Ultimately, completion is when you are restored to normal regulations of emotions and responses. Bessel van der Kolk, author of The Body Keeps the Score, once said, "After years and years of working in this and grappling with this, the conclusion that many of us are coming to is that in order to help these animal, frozen, inappropriate fight, flight, freeze responses to come to an end, you need to work with people's bodily responses. You need the body to feel like it's over." Polyvagal theory. In 1997, Dr. Stephen Porges introduced what has become known as the polyvagal theory, which describes the science of safety, social connection, threat readiness, and shutdown in our nervous system. This development in understanding has been revolutionary to the medical and psychotherapeutic fields, as it makes sense of so many things that we didn't understand the functional link for. Meet the vagus nerve. It's the 10th cranial nerve, one of the most active nerves in our body, and one of the main features of the peripheral nervous system. The main function of the vagus is to send parasympathetic signals through the nervous system and to send information back to the brain in order to regulate. Effectively, it is the parasympathetic nervous system, the inbuilt brake, safety, social engagement and immobility response system. The machinery behind our fight, flight, freeze response. It's a very extensive network connected directly or indirectly to every organ in the body, and thus was named vagus, which means wandering. There are 4 main branches of the vagus nerve system. Activation of a branch induces corresponding states of autonomic function. However, it gets a little more complicated than that. The ventral vagal state This is the brake pedal, as it were. This branch of the vagus travels down our front with connections to the heart, but is also connected to the facial muscles and the larynx that produces the voice, all of which are crucial to social engagement. When we are in the ventral vagal state, we are able to engage in social connection. As a result, our heart rate decreases, our breathing slows and moves down to the abdomen, and we are more relaxed and safe. This is the interesting part about how this branch of the parasympathetic regulates us through good social connection. This is what's known as co-regulation, the process of two nervous systems regulating each other through their connection. Next is sympathetic activation. This is the gas pedal, as it were. When we are in sympathetic activation, we enter a state of alertness and response readiness, moving into survival stress. Initially a frozen state of alert immobility to gather data, adrenaline is then secreted. Our heart rate increases and blood flow is increased to our extremities, preparing us for fight or flight. Our conscious mind goes into hypervigilance and we assess whether fleeing or confrontation is going to be necessary. Long-term and or consistent states of activation cause wear and tear on the system, which is why activation needs to be minimized and moved out of as soon as we notice. Next is dorsal vagal shutdown. If the ventral is the brake and the sympathetic is the gas, then the dorsal vagal shutdown is both the brake and the gas applied together, locking up all the acceleration energy within the car, losing momentum and grinding to a halt. This branch of the vagus travels down the back and into the viscera or gut and seeks regulation in immobilization. When we are in dorsal vagal shutdown, we enter a functional freeze state. The nervous system has deemed that you can't run or fight, but we can hide. Just like the opossum playing possum, we play dead in the hope that the threat or stressor will pass. We are only supposed to ever be in this state for mere moments at a time, and yet most of us are regularly spending unforgivable amounts of time there. This forced overworking of the engine while the system is locked in place obviously leads to extensive wear and tear, and if sustained, major systemic problems and breakdown. This is what's known as high tone dorsal, meaning high vagal tone, meaning parasympathetic activity above baseline. Rest and digest. This is the handbrake, as it were. When the dorsal vagus is operating in low vagal tone, this induces what's known as the rest and digest mode. This is the calm maintenance mode. One of the points of confusion is sometimes the ventral vagal mode is also labeled as rest and digest when they're slightly different. In this mode, we are immobile and vulnerable, but we are rejuvenating ourselves in many ways. When we sleep, we give our body and brain a chance to rest. We carry out cell repair amongst a laundry list of other repairs. And when we eat, we are taking on board vital fuel and nutrients for the body and brain. So how does all this relate to trauma? As I mentioned, each of these modes of the vagus nerve induce a certain physiological state. Our perception, our responses to stimuli, our decision making are all likely to be different when in each mode. Something that you would perceive as neutral when you're in ventral vagal, you will perceive as a threat when in sympathetic activation. You will literally appraise yourself and the world differently depending on your state. So in order to downregulate an activated state or upregulate a depressed state, we need cues or signals of safety. What this means is signs that you are not under threat, green flags showing you are safe or in the company of those that you have good connections with. So finding ways to focus on the cues of safety will help to mitigate the cues of threat. This process is called regulation, and we can both self-regulate with resources and changes in physiology and co-regulate with another person or appropriate mammal like a dog. Post-traumatic growth. As I've explained before, trauma can destroy, and from the rubble a better self can emerge. Otherwise, what emerges is just a person with damage. How we move out and away from the trauma paradigm is known as post-traumatic growth. This is a subject that I will be covering with its own chapter in the larger course in development. However, it's crucial that I touch on it here. Trauma forces a change that can either destroy us or remake us into something new. It melts us down so we can either remain a miserable puddle or we can recast ourselves. Not only is trauma an opportunity for change, it's more importantly the harsh lesson of the necessity to change. After a complex trauma, you cannot go back to how it was or who you were, because the person you were led you to where you went, and vice versa. You need to build a different narrative and identity, ultimately resolve to lead a different life. First of all, though, we need to drill this in that we have survived the trauma. This is called affirmation of your survival. There are two different things that you can do to start affirming your survival. First, you need to reach the point of being able to accept within yourself by acknowledging it, and then second, make a note of it. The act of physically writing something down makes you more likely to hold yourself accountable for what you're writing. Make the effort to introduce and maintain a new mantra. Acknowledge out loud that I have survived. Bring your emotions to the recognition that you are out of that traumatic situation and that it didn't kill you. Chances are you are a little, maybe much older now than you were then during the trauma, and you are in a different place now. You can't still be back there when you are clearly somewhere different now. So you must have survived. And this nicely concludes our session on trauma and on to the first of our exercises. Exercises. Number 1, epilogue of survival. Building from what we just discussed, here is how to write your own epilogue. Start it with the following sentence stem. I know I have survived because... So you will now list or describe all the things that are different or new now following the trauma. You may be living somewhere else. Refer to a calendar, not to count the days necessarily, but to draw your awareness to the fact that time has passed since the trauma. Look for all the evidence that points to the fact that you have survived past the trauma and are alive now. Another thought that can extend from this is the idea of celebrating your survival. What would that mean for you? Number 2, vagus nerve stimulation. The vagus nerve mostly deals with our parasympathetic nervous system response. And there are a lot of places on the body where we can manually stimulate this nerve. For the sake of time, I'm going to focus on one place in particular, which is our auricular branch underneath the ears. Keep in mind that this doesn't work for everyone. So, using your thumb and index finger, place your thumb behind your ear like this. Curl your index finger down the front of the ear so the fingertip sits inside the earlobe. From here, gently grip your earlobe and make gentle circular motions forward, then backward. For increased effect, do the same on your left side. Number 3, trapezium breathing. Sometimes we are just too possessed by negative thoughts and emotions to think of something positive. Sometimes we are actually in need of self-administered trauma first aid to bring us back to homeostasis. We can count on an ever-present regulating function in our body, the breath. Right now, I want you to bring your awareness to your breathing. Is your breathing deep or shallow? Rapid or slow? In your chest or in your stomach? I want you to make sure you're breathing from your stomach in slow, deep breaths. Here, you're properly using your diaphragm muscle to breathe. How you'll know that you're doing this right is that when you inhale, it feels like you're making yourself fatter around the belly. This exercise is my own version of box breathing, a parasympathetic exercise used by the Navy SEALs, with an emphasis on the exhales being longer than the inhales. For the next 2 minutes, we will be breathing in through the nose to the count of 4, holding for the count of 2 with comfortably full lungs, then letting it out through the mouth in a long exhale to the count of 6 or more, then holding for 2. Breathing in now, 3, 4, hold, 1, 2, breathing out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Hold, 1, 2. Breathing in, 3, 4. Hold, 1, 2. Breathing out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Hold, 1, 2. Breathing in, 3, 4. Hold, 1, 2. Breathing out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Hold, 1, 2. Breathing in, 3, 4. Hold, 1, 2. Breathing out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Hold, 1, 2. Breathing in, 3, 4. Hold, 1, 2. Breathing out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Hold, 1, 2. And once more, 3, 4. Hold, 1, 2. Breathing out now, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And hold, 1, 2. Now breathe normally. Check in with yourself. How are you feeling in your body now? Number 4, regrounding exercise. In this exercise, we're going to go through a simple countdown of things to remind you of your bodily sensory experience. During a trigger situation where fight or flight aren't viable, the freeze response kicks in. Trauma has a habit of pulling us into our heads and away from our bodily experience. Consider this the countdown to your escape. So make sure you're seated or in a comfortable and supported position. Start looking around your immediate environment and let's count down from 5. 5 things you can see. Give me 5 things that you can verbally identify. Like the catchphrase goes, say what you see. 5 things can be anything as long as it's in your view. You can say left leg and right leg, still counts. Got your 5 things? Okay, count down to 4 things you can touch. Identify and touch 4 objects within easy reach. Actually feel them. Do they have a unique texture or weight? Take your time with each object. If they're close by, then chances are we are very familiar with them and forget just how it actually feels to handle them. Got your 4 things? Okay, counting down to 3 things you can hear. Take a few moments to quietly take in the sounds of your environment and identify 3 separate sounds. They may not be obvious at first because we overall pay less attention to constants like the sound of your own breathing, the whirring of a laptop fan, or the sound of nearby road traffic. Got your 3 things? Okay, counting down to 2 things you can smell. Take some curious breaths in through the nose, into the stomach, and out through the mouth. Start detecting if there are any discernible smells. Failing that, check your breath. By this point in the course, you may be getting parched. Got your 2 things? Okay, counting down to 1 thing that you're grateful for. Preferably something physical, so that your gratitude can be felt in a tactile way. Failing that, take another few deep breaths and be reminded of the life-preserving process of breathing that we often take for granted. So, that's it for our chapter on anxiety. Thank you so much for watching.